The sound of sneakers squeaking on the gym floor echoed in the otherwise quiet space. It was the end of basketball practice, and as usual, the last few stragglers were making their way out. The cool evening air seeped through the cracks of the gym doors, bringing a slight chill to the skin that had just been heated by the intensity of the workout. I wiped the sweat from my brow, my breath still heavy from the drills we'd been running. I glanced over at Oliver, who was gathering his things on the other side of the court, his dark hair sticking to his forehead in damp strands. Oliver and I had been best friends since grade school. From the moment we met, it was like the universe had aligned to place us in each other's lives. He was the kind of person you could spend hours with, doing absolutely nothing, and it would still feel like time well spent. Whether it was marathon video game sessions, kicking back and watching movies, or getting into heated debates about which superhero would win in a fight, we were inseparable. Yet lately, there was something different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air between us had changed. Every interaction, every shared glance carried a weight it didn't have before, and it was throwing me off balance in a way I wasn't sure I liked. I grabbed my water bottle and tossed it into my gym bag, trying to shake the thoughts from my mind. It wasn't like we hadn't spent time in the locker room together a million times before. It was routine at this point. Everyone else would rush off, eager to get home. But Oliver and I would always linger, the last ones to leave. We'd talk about the game, our plans for the weekend, or just about anything that crossed our minds. It was easy. It was us. But now something was different, and I wasn't sure why. As we walked toward the locker room, I couldn't help but steal a glance at Oliver, who was smiling to himself about something. It was that crooked smile, the one that always made it hard for me not to smile back, even if I didn't know what he was thinking about. But today, that smile felt like it meant something more, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. We entered the empty locker room, the door swinging shut behind us with a quiet thud. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the space as I headed to my locker, my mind still running through the drills we'd practiced that day, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the fact that my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with basketball. "What a practice," Oliver said, breaking the silence as he pulled his shirt off, tossing it into his bag. "Coach really went all out today." "Yeah," I muttered, focusing on untying my shoes. Felt like I was going to collapse halfway through. Oliver laughed, that deep, familiar sound that normally put me at ease. But today, even his laugh made my stomach tighten. What the hell was going on with me? I finished untying my sneakers and began to change out of my uniform, my fingers fumbling with the fabric. My brain kept replaying the events of the past few weeks. How I'd started catching myself watching Oliver just a little too long during practice, noticing things about him I hadn't noticed before. His smile, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he stretched, the sound of his voice when he said my name. It was all driving me crazy, but not in a way I could understand. I tried to shove the thoughts away, focusing on the routine of changing clothes. I couldn't let my mind go there. Not with Oliver, my best friend. That was the kind of thinking that could ruin everything. "You good, man?" Oliver's voice pulled me out of my thoughts, and I glanced over at him. He was leaning against his locker, one eyebrow raised in concern. "You've been weird lately." "Me? Weird?" I forced a laugh, rubbing the back of my neck. "Nah, I'm just tired. Practice kicked my ass." He didn't look convinced, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to figure me out. Oliver knew me better than anyone, and that was part of the problem. He could always tell when something was off, even when I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. "Come on," he said, smirking as he grabbed his towel and slung it over his shoulder. "We've been best friends since forever. Don't try to hide it." Something's up. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I considered telling him the truth. About everything. How I'd been feeling, the confusion that had been building inside me every time I looked at him. But the words lodged in my throat, trapped by the fear that once I said them, there would be no taking them back. "I'm fine," I said instead, the light tasting bitter on my tongue. "Seriously." Oliver shrugged, dropping the subject, but I could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't going to push me, but he wasn't going to let it go either. That was the thing about Oliver. He knew when to back off, but he never forgot. As the days went on, the strange tension between us only grew. It was like there was an invisible line we had always walked, and now it was blurring, making it hard to tell where our friendship ended and something else began. It wasn't just in the locker room either. Every time we hung out, whether it was watching a movie at my place or shooting hoops at the park, there was this undercurrent of something I couldn't name. I found myself paying more attention to the way he moved, the way his hand would brush against mine when we passed the ball, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. It was like everything about him was magnified, and I couldn't stop noticing it. One evening, we were at Oliver's house, sprawled out on the couch after practice, watching some dumb action movie. I wasn't even paying attention to the screen, though. My mind was racing with thoughts I didn't want to confront, and my body was hyper-aware of how close we were sitting. His arm was resting on the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder, and every time he shifted, I could feel the heat of his skin. I tried to focus on the movie, but my thoughts kept drifting. What would happen if I just reached out? If I just let myself touch him, let myself close the distance that had been shrinking between us for weeks now? It was a dangerous thought, and I tried to push it away, but it kept coming back, stronger every time. Suddenly, Oliver spoke, his voice pulling me back to reality. "Hey, you've really been off lately." There it was again, the question I'd been avoiding. I turned to look at him, and there was something different in his expression. It wasn't just concern anymore. It was curiosity, like he was waiting for me to say something, to admit whatever it was I'd been holding back. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck. How could I tell him? How could I explain that every time I looked at him now? I felt things I didn't know how to handle. "I don't know, man," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's just a lot on my mind." Oliver studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine, and I had the terrifying feeling that he knew. That somehow, without me saying a word, he could see exactly what I was struggling with. Then, without warning, he shifted closer, his hand brushing against my arm. It was a simple touch, one we'd shared 100 times before. But this time, it felt different. His hand lingered, his fingers trailing down my skin, and my breath caught in my throat. "I've been thinking too," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the movie. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Was this really happening? Was he saying what I thought he was saying? Before I could even process it, Oliver leaned in, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, and the air between us was electric, charged with something I hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge until now. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice trembling just slightly. I swallowed hard, my body frozen in place. The only answer I could give was the one I'd been running from, and as the silence stretched between us, I realized there was no turning back. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. That single word changed everything. The tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even months, finally snapped. In one breathless moment, Oliver closed the gap, and our lips met in a kiss that felt both inevitable and completely unexpected. It wasn't a slow, tentative kiss. It was filled with the urgency of everything we had been holding back. His hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. I couldn't. The moment our lips touched, it was like something clicked into place, like we had crossed a line that had always been there. Even if we hadn't seen it, my mind went blank, and all I could focus on was the way his body felt pressed against mine, the way his fingers gripped my skin. The world outside the couch didn't exist anymore. It was just me and Oliver, caught in a moment that felt like it had been building forever. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, the silence was thick with everything that had just happened. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, my heart racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. What does this mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Oliver didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his hand still resting on my arm, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we'll figure it out." And in that moment, despite all the confusion and fear, I believed him. Whatever was happening between us, whatever this was, it was real. And together, we'd find out what it meant. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, golden shadows through the windows of the coffee shop where I sat, stirring my drink absent-mindedly. The usual buzz of chatter surrounded me, but I barely registered it. My mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts that had been haunting me for days now. Across the table, Adrian was talking, his voice blending into the background noise as I nodded along, pretending to listen. It wasn't that what he was saying wasn't interesting. It was. Adrian had always had a way of making the most mundane stories sound engaging, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was me, or more specifically, the way I'd started feeling whenever we were together. This tension, this awareness of him that I couldn't shake. It had started creeping in weeks ago, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was there. It hung in the air between us like a shadow, following me wherever I went. I'd known Adrian for years. He'd been my closest friend, the one person I could talk to about anything. We'd been through everything together, good times and bad. But somewhere along the line, things had shifted, and now every time I saw him, I felt this strange pull that I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was just a phase, maybe even something I was imagining. I chalked it up to spending too much time together or being too comfortable around him. But as the days passed, I realized it wasn't going away. In fact, it was getting stronger. And now, sitting across from him, watching him talk with that easy smile, it hit me like a tidal wave. I was falling for Adrian. The thought hit me so hard that I nearly dropped my cup. How had I not realized it before? How had I not seen what was happening? All the late-night conversations, the inside jokes, the effortless way we understood each other. It had been building to this. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as the truth settled in, as clear as day. Adrian paused mid-sentence, noticing my distracted expression. His brow furrowed slightly, his deep brown eyes locking onto mine with a look of concern. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice cutting through the haze of my thoughts. I blinked, forcing a smile as I tried to gather my scattered thoughts. "Yeah, sorry," I said, my voice sounding more strained than I intended. "I'm just lost in my head, I guess." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression softening but still curious. "You sure you've been acting weird lately? Like more than usual?" he added with a teasing grin, trying to lighten the mood. I laughed nervously, but the weight of my realization hung heavy between us. I could feel it pressing down on me, demanding to be acknowledged. But how could I say it? How could I tell him what was really going on inside my head? I wasn't even sure I fully understood it myself. Adrian's eyes narrowed, and I could tell he wasn't buying my weak attempt to brush things off. "Come on, man," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Talk to me. What's going on?" I swallowed hard, the words forming at the back of my throat, but fear kept them locked away. My mind raced, a storm of confusion and uncertainty swirling inside me. What if I told him? What if I laid it all out on the table and everything between us changed? The risk felt too great. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him, of ruining the friendship we'd built over the years. But at the same time, I couldn't keep pretending everything was the same. I couldn't ignore what was happening inside me, not anymore. Taking a deep breath, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and met Adrian's gaze. "It's just things feel different lately, you know." I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about stuff." His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Different how?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "How do you tell your best friend that you've been having feelings you don't fully understand? That the way you look at him now is different from how you used to?" I ran a hand through my hair, my palms suddenly sweaty. "I don't know, man," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I've just been feeling weird." Adrian didn't say anything at first. He just watched me, his eyes never leaving mine. And for a moment, the air between us felt heavier than ever. I could feel the tension building, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the silence. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned in, his expression soft but intense. "Weird how?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, as if he already knew the answer and was waiting for me to say it out loud. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse racing as I struggled to find the courage to be honest with him, with myself. My mouth went dry, and for a second, I considered backing out, changing the subject, and pretending like everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option anymore. I began, my voice trembling. "I think I've been feeling something I didn't expect. About us." Adrian's eyes widened slightly, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed what I was saying. His gaze softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle, like he was afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing we had in that moment. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and then I said it. "I think I have feelings for you," I whispered, my words barely audible. But they hung in the air between us like a confession I couldn't take back. The silence that followed was deafening. My heart felt like it had stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of my own shallow breathing as I waited for his response. I dared not look at him, terrified of what I might see in his expression. But then, after what felt like a lifetime, Adrian spoke. "I've been feeling it too." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and I finally looked up at him, my eyes wide with shock. "What?" I breathed, barely believing what I was hearing. Adrian smiled softly, his expression filled with a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability. "Yeah, man," he said, his voice steady now. "I've been feeling it too, for a while now. I just didn't know how to bring it up." The weight that had been pressing down on my chest suddenly lifted, replaced by a rush of relief so intense it nearly knocked me off my chair. I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up with the moment. All this time, I had been terrified of what would happen if I told him the truth. And now here he was, telling me he'd been feeling the same thing. A laugh bubbled up from my chest, and before I knew it, I was grinning like an idiot. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice full of disbelief. Adrian chuckled, leaning back in his chair. And for the first time in weeks, the tension between us seemed to melt away. "Yeah, I'm serious," he said, shaking his head in amusement. I thought I was the only one going crazy. We both laughed then, the sound breaking the silence that had felt so suffocating just moments before. It was like a dam had broken, and all the confusion and tension that had been building between us finally flowed free. As our laughter died down, Adrian leaned forward again, his expression more serious but still soft. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with a kind of anticipation. I thought about it for a moment, letting the reality of our conversation sink in. "I guess we just figure it out," I said, smiling at him. "Together." Adrian smiled back, that familiar crooked grin that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay. And in that moment, sitting across from him in the golden light of the setting sun, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The night was still, the quiet hum of the city outside barely audible through the thick walls of Adrian's apartment. Inside, the atmosphere was different, charged with a tension that neither of us had acknowledged, but both of us had felt for far too long. We sat on his couch, side by side, the glow from the TV flickering across the room, though neither of us was paying attention to the movie playing. My mind had wandered hours ago, lost in thoughts I couldn't shake, feelings I had tried to ignore for weeks. The same pull that had been building between us was there, stronger than ever, and I could feel it in the way Adrian's leg brushed against mine, the subtle shift of his body as if he were just waiting for the right moment. I glanced over at him, catching the soft light reflecting in his eyes. His face was relaxed, but there was something behind his calm exterior, something that mirrored the turmoil I was feeling inside. He was nervous too. The space between us felt impossibly small, and yet it was like a chasm that neither of us had dared to cross. Not yet, but it was there, and I could feel it. That invisible line hanging in the air, begging to be crossed. I shifted slightly, trying to focus on the movie, but my heart was racing, and every small movement Adrian made drew my attention back to him. My pulse quickened as I realized how close we were, how easy it would be to reach out, to close that distance once and for all. Adrian must have sensed it too, because he turned toward me, his voice low as he spoke. "You've been quiet all night," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "Something on your mind?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. How could I explain what I was feeling without sounding like I'd lost my mind? I could lie, pretend that everything was fine, like I had been doing for weeks. But I was tired of pretending, tired of ignoring the growing tension, the electricity that sparked every time we were alone together. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "There's a lot on my mind." Adrian didn't look away, didn't press me for more, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. He was waiting for me to say it, to break the silence that had grown between us, but I wasn't sure I had the courage. The seconds stretched into minutes, the air around us heavy with unspoken words. I shifted again, my hand brushing against his on the couch. And suddenly, the small, innocent touch felt like a jolt of electricity, sending a shockwave through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited for him to pull away, to pretend like nothing had happened. But he didn't. Instead, Adrian's fingers curled slightly, brushing against mine, lingering in a way that made my heart skip a beat. He didn't speak, didn't move, but that small gesture, his hand resting against mine, said more than words ever could. I looked up at him, my pulse racing, and for the first time, I saw it clearly in his eyes. The same thing I had been feeling for so long. That pull, that desire to cross the line, to take this friendship to a place we had never dared go before. Time seemed to slow as we sat there, both of us waiting, both of us afraid to make the first move. The tension between us had been building for weeks, months even, but now it felt like it was about to break, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. Adrian, I said quietly, barely able to get the words out. I don't know what's going on between us, but it feels like. He didn't let me finish. Before I could even find the words to explain what I was feeling, Adrian shifted closer, his hand moving to rest on my thigh. His touch was gentle but deliberate, and when his eyes met mine again, I could see the same uncertainty, the same hesitation that I was feeling. I know, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt it too. The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. The line we had been dancing around for so long was right in front of us, and I knew that if we crossed it, everything would change. But I didn't care. I leaned in slowly, my breath catching as Adrian's hand tightened slightly on my leg. His eyes flicked to my lips, and that was all the encouragement I needed. In that moment, I couldn't think about the consequences, about what would happen next. All I knew was that I wanted this. I wanted him, and I couldn't hold back anymore. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were testing the waters. But as soon as our lips touched, the floodgates opened. All the tension, all the unspoken feelings that had been building for so long, finally came crashing down around us, and suddenly nothing else mattered. Adrian's hand slid up my arm, pulling me closer, and I responded without thinking, my hands tangling in his hair as I deepened the kiss. The line we had been so afraid to cross was gone, obliterated by the intensity of what we were feeling. And there was no turning back now. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, but the moment was far from over. Adrian's eyes searched mine, a mixture of desire and uncertainty swirling in his gaze. Are we really doing this? He asked, his voice rough. I nodded, my heart pounding. Yeah, I said, my voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. We are. With that, he pulled me into another kiss, this one more intense, more desperate. The room around us seemed to disappear, the world narrowing down to just the two of us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was him, about the way he made me feel, and the realization that we had finally crossed the line we'd been tiptoeing around for so long. Adrian's hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a rush of excitement, a thrill that I hadn't expected. This was real. This was happening. And for the first time, I let myself embrace it fully. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting together, both of us breathless and slightly dazed, I couldn't help but smile. Adrian was smiling too, a soft, almost relieved expression on his face. We had crossed the line, and nothing would ever be the same again. But that was okay. Guess there's no going back now, I said, my voice light but filled with a newfound sense of certainty. Adrian chuckled softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. No, he agreed, his voice warm. And in that moment, I knew that crossing the line wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The night was still, the apartment quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. The air between us felt heavy, loaded with the weight of everything that had just happened. I sat on the edge of Adrian's bed, my heart still racing, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. Across from me, Adrian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes focused on the floor. Neither of us knew what to say. We had crossed the line, that invisible boundary that had separated friendship from something else, something deeper. And now we were left with the aftermath of it all. The fear of what came next, the kiss, the touch, the closeness that had filled the last few hours. It had all felt right in the moment. But now, in the quiet that followed, doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. And I could see it in Adrian's eyes too, the questions, the uncertainty. We had crossed into new territory, and there was no going back. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think of something. Anything to say that might break the silence. So I began, my voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Adrian looked up at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't answer, and I felt my stomach twist with anxiety. The silence dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. I don't know, he admitted finally, his voice low and rough. I really don't. It wasn't the answer I'd been hoping for, but it was honest. He was just as lost in this as I was, just as unsure about what came next. The weight of the uncertainty pressed down on us both, making the room feel smaller, more suffocating. I sighed, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. This changes everything, doesn't it? Adrian nodded, his gaze flicking to mine. Yeah, it does. We both knew it. There was no denying that what had happened between us had shifted the ground beneath our feet. What had once been a solid foundation of friendship now felt shaky, uncertain, like we were standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand. I mean, what do we tell people? I asked, voicing one of the many fears that had been swirling in my head. What if they find out? Adrian pushed away from the wall, pacing the small space in front of me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, tension radiating off him. I don't know, he said, his voice tight. I don't know what we tell people, or if we tell them anything at all. The thought of keeping this a secret sent a wave of unease through me. But the idea of people finding out, of facing the questions, the judgments, whispers, was even worse. We had stepped into something neither of us were prepared for, and now the consequences of that choice loomed over us. We can't just pretend it didn't happen, I said softly, more to myself than to him. We can't just go back to how things were. Adrian stopped pacing, turning to face me. His eyes softened, and I could see the same fear, the same confusion in his expression that I was feeling. Do you want to go back? He asked quietly, almost hesitantly. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Did I want to go back? Did I want to pretend that kiss, that connection we had felt, hadn't happened? That nothing had changed between us? No, I said finally, shaking my head. I don't. Adrian's shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction at my words, but the tension in the room didn't dissipate. We both knew that not wanting to go back didn't make this any easier. It didn't make the fear of what came next any less real. What if it all goes wrong? I asked, my voice barely audible. What if? What if we lose everything? The friendship, the trust. Adrian moved toward me, sitting down beside me on the bed. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there in the silence, the weight of my question hanging in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice quiet, but steady. I'm scared of what this means, of what comes next. But, he paused, taking a deep breath. But I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you. His words hit me harder than I expected. A flood of emotions rushing through me all at once. Relief, fear, hope, and something else, something deeper. I turned to look at him, and for the first time since this had all started, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't just scared of what people would think, or of how this would change things between us. He was scared of losing me, just like I was scared of losing him. We can't predict the future, he continued, his hand brushing against mine in a small, comforting gesture. But maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe we just figure it out as we go. I let out a shaky breath, the knot of anxiety in my chest loosening just a little. You really think we can do that? Adrian smiled, a small tentative smile, but it was enough to ease some of the tension between us. I think we can try. I looked down at our hands, his fingers now intertwined with mine, and for the first time that night, I felt a sense of calm. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been before. Maybe we didn't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was okay to be scared of what came next, as long as we faced it together. I'm with you, I said, squeezing his hand gently. We'll figure it out. Adrian nodded, his eyes softening even more as he looked at me. Together. In that moment, the fear of the unknown didn't seem as terrifying. It was still there, of course, the uncertainty of how this would affect our lives, our friendship, everything. But it wasn't paralyzing anymore, because now we were facing it together. Whatever came next, we would take it one step at a time. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. I stood by the window, staring out at the city lights that flickered in the distance. My hands were clenched into fists, resting against the cool surface of the windowsill, as if I could ground myself through sheer force of will. Behind me, I could hear Adrian shifting on the couch, the silence between us growing thicker by the second. I didn't know how we had gotten to this point. A few weeks ago, things had been normal, simple. We were friends, best friends, the kind of bond you never thought twice about. But then came that night, the night we'd crossed a line we had never even acknowledged before. That kiss had changed everything, and now the question lingered in the air between us. Would we take the risk and see where this could go? Or would we bury it and pretend like nothing had happened? The fear of the unknown gnawed at me. But beneath that fear was something stronger, something I couldn't ignore any longer. What are you thinking? Adrian's voice broke the silence, low and hesitant. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. How could I explain the whirlwind of emotions that had been tearing through me since that night? The thrill, the fear, the hope, and the doubt, it all collided inside me, leaving me unsure of where to even begin. I'm thinking about us, I admitted, turning around to face him. About what happens if we take this risk. Adrian's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I could see the same uncertainty reflected in his gaze. But there was something else there too, something unspoken, something that felt like a promise. He stood up from the couch, walking over to me, his hands slipping into the pockets of his jeans as he leaned against the wall. I've been thinking about it too, he said quietly. And yeah, it's scary, but I can't stop thinking about what we could be if we just gave it a chance. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had been so focused on the risk, on the potential for things to go wrong, that I hadn't really let myself think about what could happen if it went right, if we worked, if we were more than just best friends who had shared a kiss. Could we be something more? Something real? I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. What if we screw everything up? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What if it doesn't work and we lose what we have? Adrian was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady as he studied me. Then, without warning, he reached out, taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring, and it sent a jolt of something. Hope? What if it does work? He countered, his voice gentle but firm. What if this is exactly what we've been waiting for, and we're just too scared to see it? I looked down at our hands, intertwined, and the fear that had been gnawing at me for days began to loosen its grip. There was something about the way Adrian was looking at me, something that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe we had been waiting for this for each other, without even realizing it. But what if we get hurt? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. What if it's too much, too fast? Adrian squeezed my hand, his eyes never leaving mine. Then we figure it out, together, and the way he said it. So simple, so certain made my heart skip a beat. The fear was still there, of course, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. Because now standing here with him, I realized that I didn't have to face it alone. Adrian was right. We didn't know what would happen next, but we could figure it out together. And that was enough. I let out a shaky breath, the weight on my chest finally lifting. You really think we can do this? Adrian smiled, a small, tentative smile that sent a wave of warmth through me. I know we can. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe taking the risk wasn't about losing everything. It was about finding something we had both been too scared to reach for before. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let's take the risk. Adrian's smile widened, and he pulled me closer, his hand still holding mine. No turning back now, he teased, his voice light but filled with something deeper, something that felt like trust. I don't want to turn back, I admitted, my voice steady this time. And I meant it. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or uncertainties lay ahead, I was ready to face them. With Adrian by my side, the risk didn't seem as terrifying anymore. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "I've wanted this for a long time," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. I just didn't know how to say it. My breath hitched in my throat as his words sank in. All this time, I'd been so focused on my own fears, my own doubts, that I hadn't realized Adrian had been feeling the same way. The connection between us wasn't just one-sided. It had always been there, waiting for us to take the leap. "Well," I said, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "You said it now." Adrian chuckled, and for the first time that night, the tension between us dissolved, replaced by something lighter, something full of possibility. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Yeah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I guess I did." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of the decision finally settling over us. But instead of feeling overwhelming, it felt right. Taking the risk wasn't about fear anymore. It was about hope, about trusting that whatever came next, we would face it together. I pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, my heart racing but steady. "So, where do we go from here?" Adrian smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at me. "Wherever we want," he said simply. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't need to. We had each other, and that was enough. The air in the room was thick with a silence neither of us had the courage to break. I sat on the edge of my bed, my thoughts spinning in every direction, while Adrian passed back and forth across the room, his movements restless. It had been only a few days since we had agreed to take the risk, since we had crossed that line that changed everything between us. And now, standing in this new space between friendship and something more, everything felt raw, uncharted, and fragile. I watched Adrian for a moment, trying to gauge his mood. But he kept his back to me, his fingers tugging at the sleeves of his jacket, like he didn't quite know what to do with his hands. "Adrian," I said softly, breaking the silence. "Talk to me." He stopped pacing, but he didn't turn around. For a long moment, I thought he might not say anything at all. Then, with a heavy sigh, he finally faced me, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm trying to make sense of this," he admitted, his voice low and uncertain. "I don't know what we're doing, or how to handle this." These words echoed my own thoughts. I didn't know how to handle it either. The feelings between us, ones I had never acknowledged until recently, had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface. But now that we had acted on them, everything felt different. We weren't just best friends anymore. We were more, and that terrified me as much as it excited me. "I know," I said quietly, nodding. "I'm trying to figure it out too." Adrian sat down beside me on the bed, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But there was a distance in the way he held himself, like he was still hesitant, unsure. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing again. "I didn't expect it to be this complicated," he muttered. I let out a soft laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Yeah, it's not as simple as I thought it would be either." For a few moments, we just sat there in silence, side by side, but each lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us, the questions neither of us knew how to ask. How do you move forward when everything between you has changed? How do you hold on to the familiarity of what you had while navigating the uncertainty of what you've become? "I don't want to lose you," I said suddenly, my voice quieter than I intended. The words slipped out before I could stop them, but once they were out, I knew they were true. "That's my biggest fear in all of this, that we'll mess this up and lose each other." Adrian turned to look at me, his expression softening. "You won't lose me," he said firmly, his hand reaching out to touch my arm. "No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his voice, in his touch, sent a rush of relief through me. I had been so focused on the possibility of things going wrong that I hadn't let myself fully consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could go right. that maybe this new connection between us was something worth fighting for. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I want this. Adrian's hand slid down my arm, his fingers lacing with mine. The simple gesture sent a surge of warmth through me, and suddenly the distance between us didn't feel so vast anymore. Me too, he said softly. I've wanted this for a long time, but I was always too afraid to say anything, afraid of what it might change. I squeezed his hand, feeling a sense of connection in that moment that I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about physical attraction or the excitement of something new. This was deeper, something that had been growing between us for years, even if we hadn't realized it. It was the bond we had built as friends, now evolving into something more. I don't want to ruin what we have, I said, voicing the thought that had been nagging at me since that night. But I think we have to trust that this can work. Adrian nodded, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand in a soothing motion. We've always been good together, he said with a small smile. I think we just have to figure out how to be good together in a new way. His words made sense, and as he said them, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet certainty that, despite the fear and uncertainty, we could make this work. We just had to take it one step at a time, like Adrian had said before. We didn't need to figure everything out right away. We just needed to trust in the connection we already had, the one that had always been there. I took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension in my chest begin to ease. Okay, I said, my voice steady, one step at a time. Adrian smiled, and for the first time that evening, the heaviness in the room seemed to lift. He shifted closer to me, his shoulder brushing against mine. And when he looked at me, there was a spark of something in his eyes, something that made my heart race in the best possible way. So, what's the first step? He asked, his tone playful but gentle. I couldn't help but smile back at him. This, I said, leaning in and pressing my lips to his. The kiss was soft, slow, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. There was no urgency, no rush, just the quiet certainty that this was right, that this was us, finding our way together. When we finally pulled apart, we were both smiling, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. We're going to be okay, I said softly, more to myself than to him. Adrian nodded, his hand still holding mine. And for a moment, we just sat there in the quiet, the new connection between us settling into something comfortable, something real. This was the start of something new, something we hadn't planned for, but something that felt like it had been waiting for us all along. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. We were ready.